So Dennis is on the front lines of Bitcoin policy and advocacy. He's the CEO and co-founder of Satoshi Action Fund, where he champions pro-Bitcoin regulations and works tirelessly to bridge the gap between the Bitcoin community and policymakers. Through his advocacy, Dennis has become a leading voice in helping governments understand Bitcoin's potential as a tool for financial freedom and innovation. Did any of you see the Pennsylvania news that Dennis announced earlier this week? You did. Yes, there's a few applauses here. So yeah, in Pennsylvania, I'm sure he'll talk about it more in depth, but effectively he passed the Bitcoin Rights Bill. It protects the right to self-custody and to run a node. Some of the most important tenets of Bitcoin tech, Bitcoin philosophy, of being a Bitcoiner generally. In this keynote today, entitled Bitcoin Policy, Unlocking Innovation Through Regulation, Dennis will explore how thoughtful regulation can actually foster innovation within the Bitcoin space rather than stifle it. I think the room is now settling down. Are we ready for one of our final keynotes of Lugano's Plan B 2024? You can make some noise. Are we ready for it? Yeah? Okay. Dennis, I think they're ready for you. The floor is yours. Please welcome Dennis Porter to the stage.
Thank you, Joe.
Let's go.
Thank you, Joe. One of the best MCs. One of the absolute best MCs in Bitcoin. Give Joe a big round of applause. Well, I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to jump right into it. So, for those of you that don't know, my name is Dennis Porter. I am the CEO and co-founder of Satoshi Action Fund, and I'm here to talk to you today about how we can unlock innovation and freedom through regulation. Now, many in this room, might be curious as to why and how we could possibly unlock innovation and protect our freedoms through regulation. And I'm going to walk you through that journey. But before I do, I want to talk to you a little bit about my journey with regulations. So many of you probably don't know my background, but I grew up in a very conservative family, a very right-leaning family that really just saw regulations writ large as the problem. And so for a lot of my young adult life, I grew up thinking the exact same thing. I grew up thinking that we needed to get rid of regulations. Regulations are bad, they're the enemy. But what I want to talk about here is how I went from thinking regulations are the problem to realizing that regulations are a tool. They're not inherently good, they're not inherently bad. They are a tool that we can use, and we should be using them to advance our freedoms, to unlock innovation. But the way I got to that process, the way I got to this point where I thought that we can actually use regulations as a tool for Bitcoin and for the greater ecosystem, all started in June of 2022. I launched Satoshi Action Fund alongside my co-founders and my team, and got to work right away trying to make sure that we could educate lawmakers and regulators about the benefits of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. I traveled the country from state house to Congress, to everywhere in between, even some city council meetings, telling lawmakers about Bitcoin and why it matters. Also, working really hard to advance Bitcoin policy. So in just a very short period of time, at Satoshi Action Fund, we have been able to introduce legislation in about 20 plus different states. So this map here shows roughly some of the states that we've operated in. And also during that time, not only have we been able to introduce that legislation, we have actually been able to introduce and pass into law Bitcoin rights bills in 4 different states in the United States. That coverage, all of this work has been covered by a number of different sources, and it's been really helpful to be able to have that information get out there. And we've also been able to not just work on policy, but also work on research and academic research. Academic research has really played a key part in our success. We've been able to get research looked at by several peer-reviewed journals, and even had our peer review work accepted into peer-reviewed journals. So it's been a wild ride along the way. But ultimately, through all of this work, through going from state by state by state, through going to Congress and working through the peer review process, I've learned a lot about regulations and ultimately came to some important conclusions. Last note here, I thought I wanted to pop in here that a really interesting thing that happened along the way is we started to get attacked by a number of different groups, including Greenpeace, who called us the most effective and most aggressive Bitcoin advocacy group in the entire ecosystem. I think they meant it as a diss, but I wear it as a badge of honor. So what did I come to? What's the conclusion I came to after traveling the world, traveling the country to be able to advance Bitcoin? I realized that regulations can drive innovation, they can boost investor confidence, and they can also protect our freedoms. But let's talk a little bit about what a regulation is. A regulation is really just a rule, or it's a series of rules, or as the American Bar Association likes to call it, regulations encompass rules. Ultimately, I want you to think throughout this talk about regulations as a rule, and really that's just as simple as that. Now let's talk a little bit about regulations at work. There are many regulations at work. We often don't complain about them too much because they work just fine and there's nothing to complain about. Some simple ones that I'd like to bring up here are speed limits. Speed limits are in effect all across the world. We have speed limits which restrict the speed that you can go, the top speed you can go, and also the minimum speed that you can go. The reason why is, of course, to keep you safe when you're on the road and to truly unlock the innovation of major highways and roadways. Now, think about it. If there were no regulations on speed, how difficult it would be to travel across these roads without worrying about getting hit from behind. So speed regulations keep us safe. Even in the Autobahn, someone said Germany, the Autobahn has a minimum speed limit because we need to make sure that there's not a huge disparity in the speeds that we drive. Another one, a few more here, pretty simple. We have regulations that provide clean drinking water. We have regulations that provide for clean streets, except for in some places in the United States. And we also have regulations which removed lead from our paint. So regulations protect innovation, but they also keep us safe. But another one, I think this is really important. This is really striking at the heart of why these regulations matter. And sometimes we have to change regulations. Well, recently, 1996, I should say, in the history of regulations, we saw a passage of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 in the United States, which re-regulated a large swath of the telecommunications industry. That re-regulation led to the innovations of wireless and broadband. As soon as that act was passed, you can see in the charts here, every single one of these charts measures either the market size, the network deployments, or the amount of investment that went into the space. All of them exploded after we re-regulated the telecommunications space. Broadband and wireless exploded, and all of the cell phones that you have on your pockets, the Zoom calls that you experienced today, the people that might be listening in on a live stream are able to do that because of the re-regulation of the space. But regulations don't just protect innovation, advance innovation, boost investor confidence, and give us clean drinking water. They also protect our freedoms. For those of you that don't know, this is the US Constitution on, let's see, what is it, your left? The US Constitution highly regulates the government. It regulates the government's ability to be able to control our speech. It regulates the government's ability to tell us who we can vote for, what we can believe, what political parties we can be a part of. So even if you ignore everything else, every other part of this talk, I'm sure you can agree to an extent that this document, which is filled with regulations, is extremely valuable. It's filled with regulations that are very hard to break, very hard to change, but generally extremely popular. And this reminds me of something. It reminds me of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is filled with regulations. Some of the strictest regulations in the world on a monetary asset, I would actually go as far as to say is Bitcoin is the most highly regulated monetary unit in the world. So Bitcoin is a great example of why rules matter and why regulations matter. It's filled with rules which took years to develop. The regulatory process is an ongoing process. We never hit a place where we have the perfect regulations and we can just stop. I'm definitely not an ossification person on Bitcoin. I think we will continue to innovate on top of Bitcoin through rule changes, through regulatory changes of the technology. But let's talk a little bit about two of the regulations in Bitcoin, which are extremely popular. Who here wants to change the total supply cap of Bitcoin? Anybody? One guy. All right. Round of applause. Two. Wow. Okay. Some people want to debase Bitcoin. That's great. I'm glad there's some contrarian views out there. Not debase. Okay, just expand. Got it. The total supply of Bitcoin, 21 million. Probably never to be changed. What are the implications of that? Well, first of all, when you have a hard supply cap, you have no inflation, which drives scarcity and value. Now let's look at the chain of command as well as on the impact of how to acquire Bitcoin. Because you cannot inflate or debase Bitcoin, that drives long-term growth, which drives users to hold that money and spend other money, which makes it difficult to get Bitcoin. In fact, it's getting more and more difficult to get Bitcoin on an annual basis. You used to be able to get Bitcoin for $1. Not hard to innovate to drive $1 worth of value to go buy Bitcoin. Today, you have to innovate $67,000 worth of value to earn a Bitcoin. In a decade, I believe you'll probably have to at least innovate to be able to acquire $1 million to be able to buy a Bitcoin. So by having a hard supply cap, you can't inflate it, drives long-term growth, which means the users are going to hodl it, which means it's hard to get from the users, which means that in order for you to get Bitcoin, you're going to be forced to innovate in order to acquire it. Now let's talk about the second one. I wouldn't say it's as popular as the total supply cap, but it is certainly an extreme form of regulation. In fact, there was an entire war fought over this regulation in an attempt to change it, and the people that saved this rule and protected it were the pro-regulation, extreme regulation camp. They won that fight, and we have the block size limit in code still today. So what did that block size limit do, though? It drives scarcity, which is great for decentralization, great for security. But also, beyond that, block space scarcity makes it hard to transact on the base layer. So what happened? We saw layer 2 innovations explode across the Bitcoin space. And they're continuing to explode. And there's continual efforts to be able to try to innovate on layer 2. And we'll probably have layer 3s eventually as well. So by being extremely regulated, by being one of the most highly regulated monetary units on the planet, we are driving innovation in how to acquire Bitcoin, and we are driving innovation on the layer 2 and layer 3 protocols. But sometimes regulations change. They don't stay the same forever. They don't stay the same forever in the real world, and they don't stay the same forever in Bitcoin either. Some changes are successful, such as SegWit and Taproot. SegWit brought us the ability to build Lightning, and some changes are unsuccessful. In fact, I would claim pretty easily that there are almost an unlimited number of attempted changes that have failed over the recent years. Many of them are Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Diamond, Bitcoin Private. All of these were attempts to change the rules, change the regulations in Bitcoin, and all of them failed miserably, especially Bitcoin SV, because Craig Wright is not Satoshi. Thank you. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the intersection. We've talked about regulations in the real world, which I believe we can get general consensus we appreciate. I don't think anybody wants to well, maybe I should be wrong. This is a room of Bitcoiners. Somebody probably wants to abolish speed limits or speed regulations across the world. But generally, I think we can agree that speed regulations are important. Clean drinking water is important. But let's talk, and then we went from there to talking about regulations in Bitcoin, but let's talk about the intersection now. Regulations that impact Bitcoin that come from the real world. So for those of you that don't know, I love Bitcoin mining. I am such a huge fan of Bitcoin mining. I travel the world to try to go to as many Bitcoin mining sites as I can. I believe that Bitcoin mining is one of the sources of some of the biggest innovations that will take place in the Bitcoin ecosystem. In fact, this is a rare photos, first time ever to be seen. In 2017, when I discovered Bitcoin, I immediately was drawn to it. I was immediately drawn to Bitcoin mining. You can see my very horrible sketch on the left of my thoughts on how to build a little pod, started building it, and ultimately got a pretty good amount of ASICs. So it ultimately capped out at about 20 ASICs before the bear market in 2018 hit, and I realized I had no idea where Bitcoin was going to go. I thought for sure it was going to go to the moon in 2017. But Bitcoin mining has a lot of innovations that I have discovered since learning about the technology. One of the most important real-world examples of the potential of Bitcoin mining is its ability to balance the grid. In the state of Texas, there's a really cool story that took place in between 2021 and 2022. In 2021, Winter Storm Uri came through and smashed down on the Texas grid, polar vortex, brought the Texas grid to its knees, and roughly 700 people died. There was billions of dollars of damages that happened on the Texas grid. Heads were rolling. They were trying to figure out how they could make improvements as time went on. A second event happened, which is that China banned Bitcoin mining. When China banned Bitcoin mining, miners across China moved out and came to the US in large swaths. And the vast majority of those miners plugged in to the Texas grid. They plugged into ERCOT. And in ERCOT, there are a number of different ways that any type of load, Bitcoin mining included, can plug in to be able to balance the grid. Well, several months later, after the miners came and plugged into the grid, another big winter storm took place, Winter Storm Elliott. But this time, the Texas grid operators had another tool in their toolbox. They were able, in the middle of that emergency, when everybody was requiring more power, when everybody was trying to stay warm, hospitals were trying to stay on, the Bitcoin miners wound down as part of their grid balancing programs that they participated in and delivered roughly 1,500 megawatts of power back to the ERCOT Texas grid, made it available for people who really needed it in that desperate moment. Well, to put it in context, 1,500 megawatts of power is enough power to heat 1.5 million small homes. It's enough power to energize 300 large hospitals. It's an incredible amount of energy that was made available to ratepayers and to the grid when they really needed it. And this is made evident not just by me talking about it. We also saw data come out from ERCOT, from Texas, which validated that this was truly happening. This is a graph of large flexible loads, AKA at the time, that was 100% Bitcoin mining in the ERCOT grid. And you can see when energy prices were spiking, which is the red, these huge spikes in energy prices which show that there's a massive increase in demand and a lack of available supply. The blue line you can see is the large flexible load Bitcoin mining winding down almost in perfect synchronous with those moments of extreme demand on the grid. Ultimately, Bitcoin miners saved lives and certainly saved the grid likely billions of dollars of damages that would have, sort of could have replicated what happened with Winter Storm Uri. So these grid balancing programs, which some of these here are on this list, Bitcoin miners participate in, some of them they don't, but all of these grid balancing programs you see on this list were brought to you by, guess what? Yes, regulations. Regulations, energy regulations, are what delivered the ability for Bitcoin miners to participate in these grid balancing programs and ultimately to balance the Texas grid in the middle of an extreme winter storm. But regulations don't just enable Bitcoin miners to balance the grid, they also protect Bitcoin miners from undue discrimination. This is a story about Idaho Power. Idaho Power tried to create discriminatory rates for Bitcoin miners because they didn't want to sell their power to Bitcoin miners, they wanted to sell it to someone else outside the state. So they created these arbitrary and discriminatory rates just for Bitcoin miners. But what happened was when they tried to pass them through the energy regulatory body there in the state, they were ultimately denied a big chunk of those regulations because there's rules in place that protect from that type of discrimination in the state of Idaho. Also federally as well. So in this next section, let's talk a little bit about what are some of the future regulations, because I get this question quite a bit. We know what the regulations are that exist today that enable Bitcoin mining. We know some regulations that probably get in the way of enabling Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, but what are some future regulations that we could focus on that could help to unlock this technology, unlock the innovation of Bitcoin? I personally believe we need to see more microgrid policy take place. We have microgrid policy at Satoshi Action, and if you're interested in seeing Bitcoin really be put to use, microgrids is a perfect example. Never before have we been able to get 100% utilization of an energy system, which is necessary for a microgrid that is islanded, but Bitcoin mining is able to accomplish this. Also, I believe we need new grid balancing programs, and additionally, I think it would be smart, some people may disagree with me, for us to pass proof of reserves, which is essentially a policy that says if you're holding Bitcoin on behalf of a customer, you have to prove transparently that you're still holding that Bitcoin. I think that type of regulation prevents things like SBF and FTX from happening ever again, at least to the degree that it did. All right, circling back to my final point here, and then I do have an announcement at the end of this here to talk a little bit about. I'm very excited about it. But my final point here, let's go back to where we started. I believe that we need clear and enforceable regulations to drive innovation, to boost investor confidence, and to protect our freedoms. I personally believe that without regulations, without rules, we would have no Bitcoin. I also believe without regulations, without rules, our rights would not be protected. And without regulations, our freedoms would not be secured. So this is the end of my talk. Thank you everybody for jumping in on this one. I appreciate you for listening through to this section. And I would like to talk a little bit about what's next for Satoshi Action. Thank you. For those of you that listened earlier to me and may know a little bit about my work, you know that I'm very in favor of bipartisan Bitcoin. You know that I care a lot about ensuring that both sides of the aisle adopt this technology, whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right. I think that there is something there for everybody. But so far, we've really only seen evidence to back up the claim that those on the right care about Bitcoin. We've seen not only 4 states that we've worked in, 4 Republican states, Republican trifecta states, which means House, both chambers and the governor are Republican. They have passed our legislation into law. We've also seen the GOP, which is the Republican Party. They have also added some of these Bitcoin rights to their party platform. More evidence that the right is adopting Bitcoin. And even beyond that, we've seen President Trump vouch support for Bitcoin, speak at the Bitcoin conference. So there's just so much evidence to back up the claim that Republicans support this technology. And I really think, as someone who cares about bipartisan Bitcoin, or nonpartisan, as some people like to say, I really believe that we should be thanking Republicans for taking leadership on this. It's an important step. Someone had to be the first through the door. Republicans were the first through the door to be able to advance Bitcoin and vouch for it and pass this legislation into law. But I also, for many years now, have had so many conversations with Democrats, liberals, progressives, those on the left, which truly led me to believe, this is with lawmakers, individuals all across the space in the USA and across the world, which led me to believe that there is this support on the left, despite what we're seeing in the media, despite what we're seeing in the news. But there hasn't been a lot of evidence to back up these types of claims, in my opinion, until now. So that's why I'm proud to announce that for the first time in US history, a Democrat lawmaker in a Democrat trifecta state will be introducing legislation in 2025 to protect the rights of Bitcoiners. Yeah. So you'll see evidence of this coming out in January. We have been working with this lawmaker for well over a year. It's a project that is near and dear to my heart as someone who comes from a blue state, to see this type of legislation move forward and to finally have evidence to back up the claim that Bitcoin is truly a technology which can unite Americans and people all across the world. Thank you.